Cero voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cero voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cero voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. El cariño que te tengo no te lo puedo negar. Se me sale la babita, yo no lo puedo evitar. Cuando Juanita y Chan Chan en el mar servían arena, como sacudí el jibe, a Chan Chan le daba pena. Limpia el camino de paz, que yo me quiero sentar en aquel tronco que veo y así no puedo llegar. De Alto Cerro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cerro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cerro voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this global webinar on Illuminating Spiritual Innovation. I'm Casper, Kuile, one of the co-founders of Sacred Design Lab. We'll just give folks another minute or so to join us. But I would love to ask you in the meantime, where are you calling in from and what brings you to this conversation? So while folks are arriving, if you want to add in the chat just where you're calling in from, I see some familiar faces in the list of attendees, but also lots of new friends. So would love to know where you are. You are all participants in a webinar, which means we can't see or hear you. So if you're worried about your background noise or anything like that, don't worry. This is hopefully an easy, simple call for you to join. So I see we've got friends joining us from Toronto, from Detroit, Pasadena, California. Kathy's at the train station. Welcome. So glad to have you all here. Alia's joining us from Slovenia. Isabella in Texas. Welcome, friends. Welcome. We're so glad to have you here. It's been a really wonderful process to do this research and now to get to share it with you all. So we'll talk you through what's coming up over the next 90 minutes in just a moment. But in the meantime, for those of you just joining us, let us know where you're calling in from and what brings you to this conversation. We're so eager to connect with all of you, and we've got lots of ways in which we're going to do that, which we'll tell you more about in the coming hour or so. More friends in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, Eric's in Sweden, welcome. Chetan's in Philadelphia, welcome, friends. The Bahamas, look at that. Cheryl, you've got the right destination to be calling in from. Great to have you here. So wonderful. I'll just give folks another moment. We've got friends in Scotland, in Berlin. Welcome, Rika. Great to have folks in New Mexico, more in Switzerland, Virginia, North Carolina. Look at this, London in the UK. Julia, welcome, also calling in from England. Leanne from Mexico City. We've got Lily in Rotterdam. Wonderful. Carmen is in Spain. Rami's in Tel Aviv. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you here. Maria's in Bulgaria. Look at this. Tiu, welcome. Calling him from London. Rabbi Danny in London as well. My goodness, someone in Guatemala, in Ethiopia. Look at this. Well, I'm in Brooklyn, New York, which is suddenly sounding very boring. So I'm glad to have you all here. As I said, my name's Casper Kuile. I'm one of the co-founders of Sacred Design Lab. And welcome to this webinar on illuminating spiritual innovation. We're so glad to have you here. Now, over the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to hear from our lead author, Angie Thurston, my dear friend and co-founder, who really led this research project and will take us through some of the key insights. We'll open with a grounding exercise just to help us all get settled and get into this conversation together. We'll hear from our wonderful funders of this project, the Templeton World Charity Foundation, Tina Cambridge and Bonnie Zala joining us. And then we'll dive into some more of the insights from this work and close with a conversation and lots of information for how you might want to be involved in this work as it goes forward. We have lots of invitations for you to do that. So we're very hopeful that this will be the first of many conversations. We have over 150 of you live with us right now, more than 500 folks registered and who'll be watching this later. So we're so excited just by the energy and the reception that this invitation has already received. And yes, Susie, we will be sharing this recording. So if you can't listen to everything live, don't you worry, you'll have a chance to do this. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. We'll have a little time for questions at the end of today's session, but really your questions are going to inform a lot of what we want to do in the future. So please use that, let us know, and you can always reach out to us at hello@sacreddesign if you have more substantive things you want to share or questions you want to ask. But as we get started today, I would love to know a little bit more about you, and thanks for sharing in the chat already where you're calling in from, but I'd love to know, how would you describe yourself? And so we're going to open a little poll in just a moment. Now, of course, these descriptors are not conclusive or definitive or in any way full-ranging, but hopefully gives us a sense and will give you a sense as well of who's in the room with us today. So would you describe yourself as a spiritual innovator, someone who's leading a project or a community or something that is innovating within a spiritual tradition? Maybe you're a connector, someone bringing together innovators or different institutions together. Maybe you're a funder already supporting this work or interested in it, or an institutional leader, perhaps a religious institution, an educational institution, or perhaps you're a scholar or researcher, or just a curious learner eager to learn more about this, or something else entirely. So you should have a little screen that's popped up. You can click one of those and vote. We'll give you just another half a minute or so just to do that as we welcome. We've got Swati joining us from India. We've got Kat calling in from San Francisco. We've got Jason in Barcelona in Spain. Wonderful. We've got folks really from all over the world here. So thank you for joining us, everyone. And Ben, our wonderful lead tech man today, I'm going to invite you to close that poll and show us the results. Let's see who's in the room. Wonderful. A great mix of folks, lots of curious learners. I count myself among them. A number of you who would consider yourselves innovating within spirituality, a lot of people connecting this world, some institutional leaders, some scholars, some funders, and some something else's, who are my favorite category because you just break stereotypes and all descriptions. So great to have you all here, whatever brings you to the conversation. And I hope this will be a stimulating 90 minutes together. Of course, this is exactly the moment that someone rings my front doorbell. So forgive me for a little bit of background noise there. I want to say that this really is, we hope, the first of many conversations with you. For innovators, we're going to send out a post-event form for you to respond to because we want to host a number of follow-up conversations with small groups so that you'll get to meet each other. We're launching a directory of spiritual innovators from around the world. So we want to learn about you and your work. And that there is potential for some in-person events as well as these virtual get-togethers. And for those of you who are studying this or funding this or institutional leaders, we really want to grow this field of spiritual innovation around the world. So please reach out to us, stay connected to the work, and we will be excited to share more as we get going. But for now, I want to hand over to my wonderful co-founder and lead author of this report, Angie Thurston. Welcome, Angie, and thanks again to everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Casper. It is so nice to be here and wonderful to see all of you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I want to start by telling you about Reverend Soin Fujio. In a few hours, in the suburbs of Yokosuka, Japan, about 20 miles south of Tokyo, he will get ready for work. Far from the banker's suits of his younger days, he will don monk's robes and prepare to meet the many who come to his temple seeking solace. Now, Fujio was moved to begin this kind of crisis care after the suicides of 3 friends. Now so many come to him that his life is one long vigil. He says, I don't leave for more than 24 hours because if I stop for one day, I might lose someone. Whenever someone comes, he starts by asking them questions to help them feel their bodies. He says, do you need heat or water? Then he takes them to walk zazen together, sometimes for 3 hours. I don't let them leave until their battery is recharged, he says, and then I recharge my own. To do this work well, Fujio has innovated within his Rinzai Zen tradition. He's combined Zen practice with Tai Chi to support embodied healing. He invites people to his meditation groups where they actually share out loud how they're feeling after each sit. He trains priests in counseling and co-chairs an association of monks dedicated to suicide prevention. Since COVID, he leads Zazen in the metaverse. Now, this is a fairly radical shift for his 400-year-old temple traditions, but these changes allow him to be a more effective leader and provider of spiritual care. In Japan, where 40% of young people report being profoundly lonely, 40%, and suicide is a leading cause of death, a majority of those under 50 say they have no reason to visit a Buddhist temple. Japanese Buddhist institutions can be perceived as detached and unconcerned, reserved for funerals and sightseeing. But Fujio is one among a host of Buddhist innovators who are actively working to address the spiritual well-being of their neighbors, placing themselves in service of the needs they feel and see. Who are the innovators like Reverend Fujio all around the world? What drives them? How do they sustain themselves? And how might we help to further their work toward flourishing? These are the questions we will explore in our webinar today. In other words, how might we address the spiritual longings of our time? To do this, we'll begin by hearing from the leaders of the Templeton World Charity Foundation, which has funded this entire project and many others at the intersection of innovation, human flourishing, meaning, purpose, and truth. We are so grateful for their support and for their vision. I want to welcome now Tina Cambridge, President and Chief Operating Officer, as well as Bonnie Punzal, Principal Advisor to the President, Big Questions in Classrooms, and the Science of Religious and Spiritual Exercises. Welcome, Tina and Bonnie.
Thank you. Thank you, Casper and Angie. I am here today with Bonnie Zoll, who has been spearheading TWCF's grant making on spiritual information, innovation, and research on religious and spiritual exercises. We are thrilled to be here and to learn from this team of researchers who have looked across the globe for people who are innovating for the sake of spiritual flourishing and spiritual progress. We at Templeton World Charity Foundation believe that humans thrive when their pursuits are grounded with a strong sense of meaning and purpose, and when they live and learn in a posture of humility and love in relation to each other and in relation to the transcendent. These dynamics, inward, outward, and upward, have been perennial in the spiritual practices and pursuits of many religions and many religious traditions.
Today, we have the opportunity to learn more about how spiritual innovators around the world have been creatively connecting the richness of their religious traditions with the contemporary concerns and needs of the people around them. We celebrate these spiritual innovators and their efforts to find from within their tradition inspiration for potential solutions that ultimately help more people to live well.
We hope that these insights will catalyze new questions that seek to broaden and deepen our understanding of ourselves as human beings, and new activities that will help people progress in their search for meaning, for purpose, and for truth Thank you for joining us today. Over to you, Angie.
Thank you so much, Tina and Bonnie, and for all of your work. It's extraordinary. Next, I would like to introduce Alicia Forde. It is my great pleasure to welcome her. She is a longtime collaborator and spiritual innovator in her own right, as well as the new chair of the advisory board for Sacred Design Lab. Alicia is going to help us ground into our bodies and spirits in a moment. And I want to invite everyone here to really take this time and this space. We want this experience of our webinar today to be spiritually nourishing as well as informative. So allow this practice to nourish you. Alicia, welcome.
Thank you, Angie. Friends, I'd like to invite you into a very simple body prayer and meditation. This prayer comes from the 14th century mystic, Julian of Norwich. And it's a prayer, it's a meditation that invites us to be in our bodies, embracing our physicality as a way to ground, connect to ourselves, and to connect to that unnameable love that transcends us all. Now, take Angie's invitation seriously to take up space, and to feel yourself in this place, to feel the ways in which you are connected to self, to that which is greater than you, and also to each other. This can be done seated, standing, or lying down. It's 4 simple movements. We'll go through it 3 times. The first time around, each movement will be accompanied by full text. The second time around, just a word. And then the third time, in silence at your own pace. And then we'll just end with a few lines of blessing. So, to begin, we await, your hands cupped as if to receive. We await love's presence, however it may come to us. Reaching our hands up with our hands open, we allow. We allow a sense of love's presence to come or not, and be what it is for us in this moment. Our hands over our hearts. We accept. We accept as a gift whatever comes or does not come. Accept that we don't know everything, and that we are not in charge. And with our hands outstretched, ready to be responsive, we attend. We attend to what we are called to, willing to be present to, and to be love's image in the world, whatever that transcendent love calls us to. Second time through, each movement accompanied by a word. We await. Allow. Accept. Attend. In silence, at your own pace. Dear ones, your work is sacred. You are here, and we are grateful.
Thank you, Alicia, for filling our cups, allowing us to feel that transcendent love that's with us as we do this work. Friends, I would next like to share a bit of the history of Sacred Design Lab and this project, as we then move toward some of the content of this webinar and what we hope to share with you today. So I co-founded Sacred Design Lab with Casper Kuile and our colleague Sue Phillips in 2019, building off of 5 years of work at Harvard Divinity School that focused on understanding and supporting spiritual innovation in the United States, especially amidst the dramatic changes in the religious landscape, especially among rising generations. We were particularly interested in the way that young people were finding and forming meaningful communities, given the trends of religious disaffiliation and the rise of the spiritual but not religious, alongside what we came to call the twin crises of social isolation and spiritual longing. This led us to write 6 reports over those many years and get to know hundreds of innovators, as well as institutional leaders from across the religious and secular landscape, all of whom were trying to contend with this disruption and change. Then 3 years ago, we had the great fortune of getting to know Bonnie at Templeton World Charity Foundation for the first time and beginning to work together. And she and her colleagues invited us to expand the scope of our work and get to know the landscape of spiritual innovation globally. This was both exciting and daunting. So to do it well, we knew we would need a research team that spanned religion and geography. And so we hired an incredible group of area researchers around the world who you see here. They conducted over 100 interviews with practitioners and scholars in 37 countries. And you can see that their research spanned continents and religions. And we also got to conduct research trips to India, the United Arab Emirates, Kenya, Egypt, Brazil, and Japan. And some of these researchers are here with us today. We could not be more grateful for their incredible work and also for just the spirit that they brought to the work, to the person. Each one of them was so personally invested in the questions that we were asking and brought their own lived experience to the research, as well as to the conversations they had with practitioners globally. So once the 15 months of research were over and we were ready to create the report, we wanted some way to visually represent the incredible richness that we had seen. And so we issued a global call for illustrations in response to the prompt, "What does spiritual innovation mean to you?" And we received incredible submissions, resulting in 10 illustrations from folks all over the world, as you see. And for those of you who have had a chance to take a look at the report, you will see these illustrations in full spread and full color. We strongly invite you to do that. So as with all of this, the hope was to bring together a community of practitioners and a community of thinkers to really explore, what does spiritual innovation mean? Why does it matter? And what calls us to do it? And so from here, let's dive into the case for spiritual innovation. Why does this work matter to us? And underpinning this work for us is the premise that our global crises are spiritual crises, that underpinning the many, many challenges we face today is a crisis of spirit. We contend that amidst the technological and economic advances that are so widespread, the march toward modernity has often neglected spiritual well-being. And this leads to widespread disconnection and existential angst. There's an imbalance, right, between our relentless pursuit of material innovation and an under-resourcing of spiritual, moral, and ethical development, which has left us with this world which is quite rich in ideas, but can feel impoverished in ideals. The consequences are far-reaching, manifesting in rising loneliness, which we spoke about, environmental degradation, social division. And addressing these crises, we believe, requires a rebalancing. We must place spiritual imagination at the center of our creative lives. How might we ground material progress with spiritual depth so as to foster a society that prioritizes collective flourishing. This is the work we are called to do. And so what then do we mean by spiritual innovation? After all of the research we conducted and conversations with both scholars and practitioners, we came to this definition. We define spiritual innovation as novel ways to address spiritual longings that contribute to the flourishing of individuals, communities, and ecosystems. So here you see that spiritual innovation is not just the creative act, but specifically one that is oriented toward flourishing. And spiritual well-being is fundamental to flourishing. These spiritual longings, which we'll describe here, we tend to describe using 3 B's. First, for belonging, to be known and loved, knowing and being known, loving and being loved. The human need for becoming, growing into the people that we are called to be. And the experience that Alicia so beautifully invited us into of experiencing ourselves as part of something more, the experience of beyond. These are, you might describe them as the longings of the soul, the longings that underpin everything else that constitutes our day-to-day lives. And our research and the world's wisdom traditions contend that those well in spirit are better resourced to work on behalf of others, contributing to flourishing. So flourishing, we describe here in this next slide as the physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being of individuals in relation to our broader contexts. So a state of flourishing then would be one in which all aspects of our lives and our communities and our world are good. And I will say we've relied a lot on the Human Flourishing Project at Harvard and our advisor, Matthew Lee, as we've explored this definition. Zen priest Angel Kyoto Williams describes beautifully this relationship between those well in spirit and the virtuous circle of love and justice in the world. She says that love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. Without collective change, no change matters. So this is where the crux of our research lived, is getting to know innovators and innovations that were contributing in these ways, right? That were really bringing forward more spiritual well-being in the world, in the people being served. And so it's important, these are a few frameworks that we came to in doing this research that we wanted to share, just to help flesh out where and how spiritual innovation can occur. So first of all, of any given innovation, we might ask, where are they innovating in relationship to tradition? Okay, so we have innovations that occur all along the spectrum. On the one hand, you have innovations inside of those that are rooted in and help to evolve religious wisdom of the past. An example being the Extreme Way of the Cross, this incredible new Polish Catholic devotional journey that's based on the traditional 14 stations of the cross, but with all kinds of new experiences built in that you can read about in our report. Then you have those on the edge. So they branch out from existing traditions, but maintain a connection. So Sadhguru's inner engineering program is a good example of this. It's deeply grounded in yogic principles, but it's also designed for broad appeal. And then you have those that are actually outside of tradition altogether. They might be originating in secular spaces, such as the Australian Spiritual Health Association, which is grounded in a scientific evidence base, but advocating for spiritually inclusive healthcare. So as we did this research, we really tried to explore things that were across this wide spectrum. The other important thing to note is that spiritual innovation addresses spiritual needs in different ways. So the innovation can occur at different kind of leverage points. So one is the practical. These are new programs, practices, and services that support spiritual well-being. So for instance, the Limud Festival in the United Kingdom is an annual celebration of Jewish life, which has fostered a global network of over 80 Jewish communities in the world. So there's a kind of, there's a new practical offering that is holding a container for people's spiritual lives. Then there's conceptual innovation, which is where new ideas and frameworks and strategies are brought forward to address spiritual longings. So we see this in an example that Casper will share more about, the Egyptian Muslim preacher Amr Khalid's curriculum for spiritual growth. He's drawing on positive psychology research as well as ancient tradition. And finally, there's distributional innovation, where you have new pathways of discovery, access, and engagement. So Conscious Kenya, for instance, is an online hub for Kenya's wellness community. It's bringing practitioners together and allowing for their work to proliferate. And we see many new tech platforms and things like that coming forward. Lastly, we can't say enough that spiritual innovation is inextricable from its context. So any new innovation is going to be highly dependent on and emergent from the conditions socially and spiritually from which it arises. So we want to tell you some more stories about this work as we've gotten to know it, and also allow you to learn about some of the themes that it falls under. So we tried to distill what is, of course, a completely expansive and impossible to categorize landscape in many ways into 4 themes that came up again and again. They were technologies of spirit, resistance and reclamation, embodied experience, and secular spirituality. So for that, I am going to hand it off to Casper to tell you more.
Thanks, Ange. And yes, for those of you who are looking at the chat and the screen and everything else, are like, I want to watch this again, fear not. We will send out a recording of this to everyone who registered. So if you like taking notes, please do so. But don't worry if you want to look at this again. And Angie's exactly right. You know, the number of stories that we got to hear, of course, pales into comparison with the number of stories that are out there. And then we had the joyful job of trying to turn those into some themes. So these really are invitations to explore these 4 themes. And let's start with that first one, technologies of the spirit. You know, there has been an absolute transformation in how people access, connect, how they distribute spiritual content, spiritual community, because of the rise of the internet. And the pandemic only made that acceleration happen even faster. So we see the rise of spiritual influencers. If you spend any time on Instagram, I'm sure you know what I mean. But one of my favorite conversations was with Khaled, who Angie just mentioned, this fabulously interesting man in Cairo who I got to visit in his home after going through the security checkpoint, I should say. Now, he really rose to prominence in Egypt and broadly in the Arab world in the 90s when he started preaching. He's kind of known as the most famous televangelist, you might say, for those of us coming from a Western audience will know that language. And he was incredibly effective at communicating with the younger generation, and he continues to do so. What makes Amr so interesting to me is the way that he constantly adapts and adopts new technologies. And so he's now at a stage in his career that he's creating his own television show. He produces the whole thing and brings together a group of young people from all over the Arab world and beyond to teach them essentially his spin on the Islamic tradition, and focuses particularly on a couple of practices that he believes are really important to the formation of a holy life, and combines this kind of tech distribution innovative tool set with a very beautiful program in which the ambassadors, some hundreds of young people, again, all around the world, these ambassadors become kind of leaders in their own community. So the pairing of digital tools with the kind of leadership development that one might expect in an in-person community is something that really set him apart. And he was very frank about the challenges of navigating a state that is very involved, shall we say, in what religion looks like in Egypt today. And he has had to navigate both the kind of religious authorities and the state as he produces this spiritual content in his context. A fascinating man, and I hope you enjoy reading that case study. I ended up liking him very, very much and seeing why he was such an effective communicator. We see rituals being done digitally as well. We interviewed Dr. Joana Baia in Brazil, who told us about the way in which Afro-Brazilian religions like Umbanda and Candomblé are being practiced today. We got to visit a community there as well, just outside of Rio. And she told us of the way in which people would communicate with religious practitioners through WhatsApp and essentially put in an order for a specific type of ritual to be performed. And they would then receive photographic evidence of a chicken that had been slaughtered as part of that ritual, as the evidence that the ritual had been completed. So again, you see the way in which people are communicating about their spiritual life, about the rituals being practiced through these new tech tools. Now, of course, the opportunities are very obvious. We see platforms like Hallow and Calm and Headspace and Insight Timer, and that's only going to grow with the rise of AI and VR. We talk a little bit about the robot priest I got to see in Kyoto, which was just another kind of little signal from what's possible in the future. But all of these technologies are deeply intertwined with market capitalism. And so one of the themes that you'll see continuously throughout the report is this question of what is, or where is the line of spiritual and religious integrity? And I think this acceleration of technology only raises that question more so. So let's look at the second theme, resistance and reclamation. That question of integrity is at the heart of this theme, because what is sacred is not for sale was one of the quotes that really stood out to us in the interviews that we as a team got to conduct. And the violent repression of religions being practiced by indigenous and enslaved people and their descendants in many colonized nations means that this idea of resistance and reclamation, often they live at the same time as people try and find a way for their traditions to live and have to innovate in order to continue the tradition. So again, in Brazil, there's a real theme of pre-colonial religious reclamation. We got to be in Brazil during the Iemanjá celebrations, Iemanjá being the mother of all orishas or deities, the great water spirit, kind of coming from the Yoruba tradition in West Africa. Now, that celebration in February had been absolutely shut down by state authorities for many years, but now is being celebrated and lifted up as kind of a great piece of cultural heritage. And in fact, some of the celebrations that we got to see were being sponsored by regional cultural authorities. So again, this theme of how religious practitioners and innovators have to navigate the state was another continuing theme. In South Korea and the Philippines, we learned about how shamanism is on the rise. A fascinating example of how LGBTQ young people were using these shamanistic rituals and engaging shamans as a powerful practice of agency. So in some ways, being shut out from religious practices, here was a way in which people could narrate, engage, and practice their spirituality with a great sense of agency. And that is something that we've seen really as a continuing opportunity, right? The explosion of interest in astrology, in tarot, in witchcraft even. Again, of course, coming with all those questions about appropriation and commercialization, but really offering people a sense of agency in their spiritual life if they have been shut out of religious traditions because of their identity or whatever other reason. I think we see opportunities for organizations, or we've seen organizations like Svara, an amazing queer Talmud study organization, Queer Yeshiva in London, also doing the same kind of thing, giving marginalized groups an opportunity to engage tradition with a great sense of agency. In China, of course, this theme of navigating state repression and personal agency is enormous. Christianity has grown from 1 million to nearly 100 million people over the last 40 years. But of course, the Chinese state is engaged in a very significant repression of Islam, Christianity, and Tibetan Buddhism. So that sense of hidden practitioners having to find a way in garages and broom closets of sanctioned Taoist temples is something we talk about in this report as well. So second theme, resistance and reclamation, very, very juicy. The third theme was all about embodied experience. We've seen an explosion of interest in plant medicine, for example. Many of you will be familiar with that. And leaders of some of those traditions, we learned about a specific teacher, Master Popo from Gabon, who teaches in the Bwiti tradition, who has innovated to use, for example, a lower and more gradual dosage of the sacred plant that he uses, of integrating spiritual world music and adding more kind of therapeutic frameworks as he shares the plant medicine that he teaches with. So we see people adapting to the contexts in which these traditions are now living. Angie mentioned the Extreme Way of the Cross, this fascinating Polish case study in which, a traditional pilgrimage is matched with a sort of extreme workout where people are hiking, something from 20 to 100 kilometers overnight in the cold, really kind of testing their physical limits as well as their faith. And there's a huge opportunity, I think, here to look at how to integrate peak experiences that people are already looking for, whether it's in nature, whether it's psychedelics. But the challenge there is how to integrate that back into everyday life, especially when people are engaging these practices by themselves and don't have a community of practice to share that with. So again, big questions being raised. And then finally, the final theme we'll mention, and of course, I invite you to read all of these in much greater detail in the report, is this idea of secular spirituality. Secular contexts are providing increasingly a seedbed for spiritual innovation through leadership programs, personal transformation workshops and apps and platforms, even bringing in spirituality into secular institutions like education or healthcare, all of which, address spiritual needs, but outside of traditional religious settings. Angie mentioned the example of the Australian healthcare system. But there's many more besides. In nurses, we learned about in Turkey and Canada and Peru are learning Reiki as one of the kind of modalities of healing that they can use with patients. We learned about the Mind Fitness program for top business executives in Tokyo. We learned about the Sangha Estidama hub in Saudi Arabia, which is set up to accelerate human progress through facilitating a culture of inner well-being for Saudi Arabia's future leaders. And similar programs in Chile and Colombia and Kenya, really finding a sort of different framing and a different organizational context in which some traditional spiritual practices are being shared. Now, again, a huge opportunity there to massively scale spiritual practices and support people's well-being, but a challenge of what happens when we lose the religious and spiritual context that gave those practices their power, especially when we lose some of the theological principles and, again, of course, the community that helped people make meaning of those experiences and integrate those practices into their everyday life. So there's much more to say about all of these. I hope this is a little amuse-bouche, a little taster of some of the kind of examples that we got to learn about. And for us, it was just such a joy and a privilege to participate in a number of these communities and see them up close. So please do check out the report. But I want to ask you, based on this very brief introduction, we'll do another little poll here where I'll ask for you to vote. Which one of these themes resonates most with you in the context of your life, in your work, your home community, maybe the work that you do? This idea of new technologies enabling people to participate in spiritual practices, this idea of pre-colonial practices and traditions kind of coming to the fore as they are being reclaimed, and perhaps more colonial religious traditions being resisted. This idea of embodied experience, people seeking peak experiences through embodied practices, or this idea of spirituality showing up in secular places, or of course, something else entirely, or none of the above. We really just want to get a sense of a snapshot of which of these resonate with your context. So we'll give you just another few moments to click in the little pop-up poll here, which one of those resonates most. And Ben, I'll invite you just to close that and share the results so we can see what this looks like within our call. Okay, so a lot of people noticing this idea of secular spaces, engaging spiritual practices, a lot of you seeing embodied experience, and some of the others showing up as well. Nobody's saying none of the above. So either that means we've done a good job or it means we're all very generous. And I think it's probably a bit of both. So thank you for sharing that. Now, we mentioned that there's going to be a lot of ways that we want to stay in touch with you. And to share more about that, I'm going to invite Angie back onto the stage to share more.
Thank you so much, Casper. And thank you all for doing that poll. That was actually an incredible spread of what you're seeing out there. So that's really cool to see. Yes, as Casper says, so kind of building on these incredible examples we've seen around the world, one of the things that we were really grappling with and that we are now really focused on at Sacred Design Lab is this question of what is promising spiritual innovation, right? Of course, we are deeply committed to spiritual work and spiritual well-being in the world. And we know that this kind of work, when not done with care or grounded in values, can actually do harm. And so there was a real question of what does it look like for spiritual innovation to bring about greater good? And also how to cultivate the work of spiritual innovators in such a way that supports their well-being and their projects, to actually reach people, given how needed this work is in the world. And so we came to these three areas that seemed to address some of what we were seeing as far as what it looked like when an innovation was promising. So one element of this was the spiritual, and what is the integrity. So the idea that the project espouses values that support spiritual well-being, and that the approach to the work matches those values. And one of the ways that that showed up was in terms of a healthy relationship between tradition and innovation. But it also showed up in other ways in terms of the organizational structure and the way that leadership is operating, and what comes about in the lives of participants because of their participation. The next has to do with project sustainability. And I can say over the last decade working with spiritual innovators that this is a big one. The question of how the project gets off the ground, reaches those it intends to serve, and then actually has the structures, resources, and leadership in place to continue and to continue to grow if that is part of the aspiration. And a lot of this raises questions of spiritual infrastructure. What is the infrastructure to support spiritual life going forward? And finally is the question of community support. The idea that we are trying to help address the crisis of isolation globally. Often spiritual innovators themselves are isolated and lonely in their leadership. This has been one of the ironies that we've encountered. And so the matter of spiritual innovators themselves being part of loving communities of support, training, mutual learning, and care, accountability from mentors and peers, connection to elders and to youngers. This is so important for their own well-being and for the quality of what they're able to bring to the world. So these areas are ones that we hope to support with our work going forward, and that we are very curious to hear from all of you going forward about ways you've found to address these as well. Our hope is that we can help participate in a broader movement toward spiritual well-being in the world through this spiritual innovation work. So we hope that we can be in conversation with you about this and can continue to make progress in these areas together. So I just want to issue an early call to action here, even though we still have more conversation and discussion to follow in a moment, but for you to be thinking about. We're going to send all of you a post-event form to indicate your interest in these topics. So just let us know if you're interested in this work of spiritual innovation and from what vantage point. We're going to have more Zoom calls. This one, of course, is a webinar, so we're talking a lot, and we're grateful you're participating in the chat, but some of the functionality prevents real conversation. So we're going to have some other Zoom calls where we can have an exchange and really get into small groups and talk about this stuff. We're going to create an online spiritual innovator directory on a platform that we're building along with some partners that we'll talk about a little later. And we intend to hold future events, and we're curious about some of the events that you might like to host or participate in going forward. So please let us know in this form after today. And as ever, we want you to join our mailing list, and you can always feel free to email us to connect about anything else. So with that, I want to now welcome up to join me two more of our colleagues along with Casper for a conversation. So I want to welcome Josh Packard, who is our co-author on Illuminating Spiritual Innovation and is also an incredible researcher and social scientist and co-founder of the Future of Faith organization. And Habib Bako, who is our strategy and operations consultant at Sacred Design Lab, and also just an incredible practitioner of both spiritual innovation and bringing out greater love and liberation in the world. So with that, I will invite the two of them to come join me along with Casper, who has been our faithful guide through this webinar so far. Welcome, Habib and Josh.
Thanks, Angie.
Hey, Angie, thanks.
Thanks for having us and that introduction. I would have never described myself like that, so I would take that. I mostly just say I like to talk. I am not a researcher or an author like you all. But what I do like to do is talk and make friends. So hi, friends on the call. I will be doing the talking on behalf of you all that cannot talk because of Zoom, jail, or whatever functionality that's on. So please use the Q&A. I don't want to be, I would fail as a job as a facilitator if we don't have enough questions. So let's get ready. So put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. And but with that, I'm really honored to be in this space with you all, truly in a global space. It really, really warms my heart in so many ways. The kind of work that you're doing, it's so impactful. But I want to start with you, Josh, and then Angie and Casper with, on behalf of all my 200 friends on the call, what was really striking as you guys approached this research? And I'll start with you, Josh.
Yeah, thanks. I was really honored to be invited into this process to help sort of coordinate some of the research. And I think as a person who like exists in the world and also exists in this research space, and we were all coming out of COVID and we all saw the explosion of travel, but then to get to see kind of from a data standpoint, just how many people were turning that like this sort of, I don't know, hobby of travel into this more intentional act of pilgrimage in so many ways. Like I had a whole lot of friends who, a whole lot, I have some friends who were thinking about hiking the Camino, right? Which is the most, like, that's the thing that kept popping into my head when I thought about pilgrimage. But then over and over and over again in this work, we kept seeing ways that other people were embarking on something that was tantamount to a pilgrimage, whether it was shrines in Japan or sort of like traditional hikes in Ireland that were turning into these pilgrimage routes that were sort of, and in some cases, things that had not started out that way, but turned into these kinds of offerings. Just the desire for people to have these really embodied experiences was super cool for me to see. It was surprising.
Thanks so much, Josh. Hopefully I could be one of your friends and join you in one of those.
Yeah, I want to do one now.
I don't know what it takes from you to join that list. I have still not gotten the invitation. But Angie, over to you. What was most striking around the research?
Thanks, Habib. Yeah, I think for me, I was just so struck by the way that people were personalizing and individualizing spiritual practices around the world, and both the beauty and the perils of that, right? So Casper spoke about shamanism, and it was just truly extraordinary to see, like everywhere from East Asia to Africa to Latin America. I mean, shamanism just emerging. And how on the one hand, that could be such an incredible tie. I remember getting to know a community in Taiwan where there were young people showing an interest in this practice that had been, on the brink of going away because the people who were holding that lineage were aging. And so, where it's very much tied to community and to land. And then on the other hand, this phenomenon of neo-shamans globally and things coming up on TikTok and witch talk and all of that, right? And on the one hand, there's such a hunger for healing, right? And so I really get it. Like I really see why there would be so much interest in this, and not to mention all the global forces and people seeking back towards something that predates colonialism. And on the other hand, there are challenges with it, right? In terms of people not necessarily having any context, or perhaps enough context for what they're engaging in. And so it just raises real questions about how might we really honor the fact that this is happening and that people are individualizing practices and taking a sense of, feeling a sense of agency around their spiritual lives, while also supporting them with training and connection to lineage and ethical formation and things like that. So that dynamic was really present for me in the work.
Thanks, Angie. And just for you all three, the Q&A, there's really popping off, like the cool kids would say. And so just getting you guys geared up for that. And I have not yet been in a webinar this year that TikTok doesn't come up, so doing something right. With that, I'll come to you, Casper. What was the most striking as you did this research?
For me, it was really the contextual nature that Angie mentioned before. I mean, speaking with, a youth minister in Nairobi, what was considered innovative there was very, very different from what that conversation looked like in Dubai. And so really, some of my favorite examples were, a Zen monk who leads surfing lessons with meditation, and like the surfing is the headline, and so engages people, to come to his retreats with surfing, but then teaches some of meditation at the same time. similar strategy, very different context, showing a movie and having free food, on a campus in Nairobi, and then engaging people in conversations about prayer and Christianity. But the context was so important in each of these conversations. And sometimes our questions were really irrelevant or rejected from the very premise. And I'm thinking especially of some of the work that our researcher who looked at the Middle East, even the word innovation for an Islamic conversation was very, very different and frankly more challenging. And so just how each of the contexts in the different parts of the globe, obviously, and different religious traditions shape the conversation about how do we talk about innovation? What does that really mean? So context.
Thanks so much, Casper. I know we could have a whole webinar just around how do we talk about innovation, and that's for again, like Angie mentioned, there's going to be more webinars, so stay tuned in. With that, I'm looking at the time. Can we transition? I know, Angie, on the top end, you talked about the sort of the three needs: relational, spiritual, and practical. And I'll start with you. Like, how do you see that show up in the research that you did? And I'll ask Angie to talk about the spiritual piece, and Casper, I'll look into you for relational, and Mr. Practical, Josh, I'll be looking at you to get us close. So how do those needs show up? Angie, over to you around spiritual.
Thanks, Habib. Yeah, and this is a passion of mine for sure, is basically the question of how the spiritual innovators themselves are trained and held and formed spiritually. We see often this hunger to deepen their own well so that they can go deep with the people in their care. And yet, because a lot of this is happening on the edge of traditions or outside of them, you don't necessarily have the infrastructure to hold people in their spiritual growth over time, right? So that is a big need that we're trying to address. And one story I can just share around that is from China, as Casper mentioned, because there's a lot of religious repression in that context, you still have all of these people carrying their spiritual longings in their everyday lives. And so on the one hand, you see that being expressed through underground churches and things like that have ministers, even if they have to often hide their work. But then on the other hand, you have a lot of young people who are just seeking in whatever ways they can. So there's temple tourism. There are apps coming around that are really widely used that support things like psychological support and online, whether it's tarot reading or astrology, these kinds of what we would maybe call new age spiritualities. But there's so much hunger and it's kind of proliferating. And yet there is an absence of training for leaders who might be able to help address that hunger, right? And so there's a mismatch there. And China is perhaps a particular context because there's also a question of legality around it. But in other parts of the world as well, there's a really missing element of training and formation for spiritual leaders that goes beyond the traditional categories and institutions that provide it.
Thanks, Angie. Casper, over to you. Relational.
Yeah, the same theme really is clear. Without those institutions that are there to support innovators, people feel really alone. And a lot of people are like, am I the only one doing this? I didn't know so-and-so was thinking about these same questions. I mean, even in the chat today, it's beautiful to see some of that, like, whoa, I'm not totally, out here by myself. And so one of the most valuable things I think we can do at this early stage is just help people connect with each other and realize like, oh, wait, you're struggling how to make this financially sustainable too. Wait, you're really struggling with where do I go for my own kind of spiritual formation, right? Just like Angie was saying, one of the case studies that we talk about is an amazing network in Kenya, where Conscious Kenya, created a platform for people to be able to access and find all sorts of, holistic practitioners, a sort of directory of therapists and healers and teachers. But for them running that themselves, like, who's there to support them? And so that's that missing infrastructure that Angie was mentioning that we hope in some way that we can help with, but we really want to find partners who take on that responsibility too, of connecting the innovators in their national context, their regional context, their religious or spiritual context. So that's a huge part of what we know we need to do is to connect people to each other.
Thanks so much, Casper. Sorry, I know you were talking about relational. I am building relationships in the chat. And it's, I love you all. Chetan, I love your energy too. This is why we're here. And they say, be careful what you wish for. We have 20 questions. Now I feel accountable to those 20 questions. I may not answer them all, but I'm putting myself accountable in front of you all. We will get the answers and we'll find time to answer those questions. Part of the relational. And Casper, I did tune you out because I was making friends. Sorry, I will watch the recording of exactly what you said. Josh,
you've had it all before.
That's Habib, I think that's great. That's just 20 more webinars we can do with 20 more questions, right? Which is exactly, I'm sure, what everybody's dream is. Look, as a social scientist, sociologist in particular, like I was so moved by the people that we encountered who are all doing this work really, I mean literally across the globe and disconnected from one another. And we sat in this position where we got to see them all, but they couldn't see each other. And the temptation, I think, I'll own my own identity here. I think the temptation for like somebody who cares deeply about them and their experience, but also comes from this like white middle and upper class Western, like I want to run in and help, right? But of course you can't run in and help. You have to tiptoe at best. And they were resistant, I think, at times in important ways to want people to run in and put structure around that because of the, I don't know, all the kinds of damage that can come when you run in and put structure around things. And yet, as a sociologist, I know how important that infrastructure is going to be. And so I think that becomes the challenge, is like, how can we come along with the right partners and voices to help provide the kind of infrastructure that a field needs really to coalesce, to be able to get the kinds of visibility that you've seen, that Casper mentioned, you see it in the chat right now, that people are so hungry for, that helps to then become part of the movement that secures resources and meets real challenges. I mean, one of the consistent things that we saw was people, sort of like a life course emerging where people would start these things, but unable to sustain them as as they got married and had kids and needed more, needed to meet more and more than just, day-to-day living expenses. And I think there's just a lot more that can be done with the field. And yet there's a real risk in like it becoming too structured and it becoming something that gets driven by external parties. I think it can be done. There are other examples of places where that has been done. But that's like this very practical thing in terms of like, what do I see from my perspective that innovators might need, and what are they saying that they need? I see that all coming around some kind of very thoughtful infrastructure that can support the field.
Thanks so much, Josh, and for the reminder of how much this work is both technical and adaptive in a way that we need the structures, but we also know, as you can sense in this space, the energy is real. Like the love, I feel it, you feel it, and we're on a Zoom link, right? So, but with that, I'll turn to you, Angie. Like, what do you see? Like, this work requires all of us on here and all the partners that could make the call. So what are some of the things that you are thinking about and some of the needs? We talked about needs, ways that collaborators can actually lean in together and start co-designing and co-creating this movement that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Habib. And that's exactly where we stand, both through the work on this report, as well as over the last 10 years of getting to know innovators and leaders in this space. The kind of energy we're seeing in the chat has been so present in this work, and the hungers have been so evident. And so at this point, we are arriving at a new phase, a new stage of this work together, where we're going to really try to get some stuff done. And thank you, Ben, for throwing the slides back up here. We are creating a hub for spiritual innovation. And our goal with that is to begin to address some of the needs we just described: the need for spiritual support, relational support, and practical support for spiritual innovators. And we've been bringing together a group of collaborators, first, mostly in the United States, which is where we are based. And on the next slide, we can show you some of those folks. These are all organizations. We call them ecosystem builders. I'm sure there is other language we could use, but basically people who have for years now been providing some of this infrastructure for spiritual innovators already. And so knowing that this work must be collaborative, and to your point, Josh, about the ethos of it, right? How do the means and the ends cohere as we go about this? We know it needs to be collaborative, and we know it needs to be responsive to context and derived from context. And so each of these organizations is providing support for spiritual innovation in context, right? Working with people from different geographies, different religious traditions, and different, settings. And yet there is a shared ethos and a shared desire to really help cultivate more infrastructure and to see spiritual innovation contribute to flourishing in further ways. So as we go forward, we really want to invite, again, all of you to think about the ways that you're already doing this work or that you might be connected to it going forward. And we're going to get into a little of that now. So Habib, why don't we enter into some introspection for a bit?
Absolutely. You got to go fast and then slow down before you go fast again. So this is going to be one of those moments where I'll ask us to slow down for a little bit. And I'm going to ask us to reflect. If you have a pen or paper around you, or grab that, or you can use your note app on your phone. And the question I have is, as you've heard all that has come up, the energy as you showed up and the grounding done by Alicia, all of that brought into context, what has inspired you so far? What has excited you? What are your concerns? What troubles you? What have you heard so far? And as you write, we're going to have some nice music that Ben is going to play. He did not actually create the music, but he's going to play the music for us to think as we spend this next 3 minutes. When stuff emerges, please put it into the Q&A, whatever questions that come up or however you're feeling, you can drop it in the Q&A. And then when we come back, we'll turn into the Q&A and have Angie, Casper, and Josh respond to whatever emerges. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking. All right. Thank you all. And I appreciate you all for leaning in. We have more questions now. Now we are at 30 questions. And we only have about 15 minutes. So we will, like I mentioned in the when I started, we will answer all those questions. We will find a way either through our newsletter and other ways or future convening. I shouldn't speak on behalf of Angie and Casper, but I started speaking on behalf of you all. So we will answer these questions. So I'll start first, and we're only, unfortunately, because of time, we're probably only going to get to about 3. With the actual question that we asked folks to journal, when it turns to the panel, what actually inspires you as you do this work that you do right now? No rush.
The deep one first. I would say it is a hope for a better future in a specific way. It's this idea that the work that folks like Soin Fujio I spoke about at the beginning and these other innovators, the work they're doing is actually operating in a different paradigm than a lot of the ways work is presented to us. It's operating with care at the center, with love at the center, and with spiritual imagination at the center. And so I get inspired by seeing just the incredibly creative ways that people are doing that and the creative and spiritual confidence that animates them. You know, the willingness to buck some of what they might have been told, either implicitly or explicitly, about what is possible and what is okay, to do something often against the odds that is so deeply in service. So getting to see that and be in any way part of it is really inspiring to do every day.
One of the questions that I'm really obsessed with is like, how do we know what to hold on to and how do we know what to let go of? And, you know, just looking through the list of attendees, I see Alicia Klein, who is here from One Table, an amazing organization that helps people host Shabbat on Friday nights, who I think is an absolute genius at answering that question. Elizabeth Slade, who leads the Unitarians in the United Kingdom, was on the call. You know, who's been really bold in thinking about what is essential about our tradition and what are we going to let go of so we can really let this bit live, even in something as like rebranding an organization. So for me, it's that kind of specificity of knowledge about the thing that is most precious in this moment, knowing that that might change, right? But in this moment, this is the gift that we have to give. And so that kind of courage and imagination is the thing that I just find infectiously inspiring.
Thanks, Casper. And Josh, I'm coming to you with a little bit of reframe or question. And this is a question from Stephanie. Josh, so as a futurist, what are some future signals you've noticed in this work that institutional church leaders should be paying attention to?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Because so much of the innovations, of course, that we're tracking here in this report are not, I mean, there are some that are connected to institutional religious expressions, but many of them live outside almost entirely, as Angie noted in that framework. I think for me, what we see here that's most relevant for sort of, especially the dominant Western institutional religions, so Christianity, Judaism, Islam, like I think we've seen some of these numbers come out in recent years around attendance, affiliation, you know, identity, practice, and they're all in the decline, right? Like people are not going to church as much as they used to. They're not practicing as much as they used to. They don't believe in God like they used to. And it's easy to draw a line, I think, from those data to a conclusion that people don't care about these questions anymore, that they're sort of like less interested in engaging with the divine in some way. And what this research did for me, and this also touches on the inspirational part, is that it's very, very clear that people are still listening to that still small voice. I mean, to draw from my own tradition of Christianity, that compels them to sit and listen and be obedient in some ways to a calling and to do things. And you see this with like Pew last year, for example, putting out a report about spirituality, which they've never done before, had always been about religion. So other people are starting to pick up on this thread. But so if anything, for institutional religious leaders, I think it would just be a reframing that just because you're not seeing people show up on Sunday mornings or Friday evenings as much, or they're not praying, or they don't check the box on a survey that says that they are Christian, Catholic, or Buddhist, or whatever, it doesn't mean that people don't care about these conversations, that they're not still trying to address the fundamental human needs that they've always been trying to address. They're maybe just not doing it in the same ways that they used to do it.
Thanks, Josh. I had a question around, this is from Eric, and he goes, what are some technologies of spirit? And I'll start with you, Casper, and then Angie. What are some technologies of spirit that we are impressed with as you did your research and it has potential for scale?
This opens up a big can of worms, because as we, one of the things that technology allows, and I think maybe, if we're familiar with restaurant reviews or product reviews, we've moved from the kind of the expert to the crowd. So at least when I'm buying something on Amazon, and forgive me, I do, I'm looking towards the kind of user reviews more than I'm looking at the expert reviews. And the same is true in terms of kind of spirituality, in terms of who's able to offer their content at scale. And so you're seeing a massive increase in terms of spiritual content creators, for example, but we're losing maybe some of the important, what some might say essential kind of filters in terms of who gets to spread their message at scale, and also what the content of that message is. That is not to say that something like the Catholic Church has always been perfect in what it has had to say at scale or what it has done, far from it. But these questions of what the ethical boundaries or considerations are, or what the checkpoints, or even like relationally, right? The absence of mentors and teachers, the absence of lineage, that can cause real problems in terms of what these technologies allow. Now, the benefits of them are that you see, people finding people like me much more easily than they would have in their own geography. So as more and more people are born into, for example, religiously mixed households, or as they maybe are born Presbyterian but find real meaning in Sufism, right? They're able to connect with a community of other people who share that experience through some of the digital tools that we have. So I'd say it's less about the specific tools of, it's all about WhatsApp, or, it's all about this particular VR platform. And it's really more about the larger strategic questions of what this kind of access allows, and what new questions, especially around the ethics, that it offers as well.
Thanks, Casper. Angie, did you want to add to that?
I'll just add something that excites me in a nerdy way. When Casper was talking about technologies of spirit, no, actually it was in the embodied experience one, but he had that quote, "Felt like heaven." So that quote was actually from a YouTube comment section when there was a record-setting concert by the Norwegian singer Aurora inside the game Sky Children of the Light. And basically I get really excited about the potentials of VR and some of this other technology to connect people specifically for worship or for transcendent experiences that would not otherwise be in a shared location, but to kind of advance beyond, here we are on Zoom, but we all know both the joys and limitations of this platform. But right, those kind of experiential potentials. Casper do you want to say anything about your visit to the robot priest? Like, it's just, I feel like we're right on the edge of some of that stuff. And once it crosses a threshold, it's going to be really cool.
Right. And some of the technological progress that's about to happen is going to take this to the next level. Yeah, I wrote a newsletter about this, so some of you may have read this story, but in Kyoto, there's a temple which has a robot priest. Now, this came about because the university in Osaka had a robotics department that wanted to play with form. And they said, well, what's more kind of structure and form than a traditional priest? And so there is this kind of silicon-faced and handed robot called Mindar, who has a program by which it speaks and teaches kind of traditional Buddhist teaching, one of the core texts. And I expected to hate it. I thought this would be so cheesy and so cringe. And it's in this circular room where there's video projected all around, and it's surround sound. And so you're sitting on a chair looking at this robot, which is a robot with just a very simple script. But there are questions that come from different parts of the room from these videos of real people's faces. I mean, they're actors, I'm sure, but real people's faces with real questions like, what happens when my loved one dies? Or like, how do I endure when I'm sick? Like real questions. And this robot just like laid down this ancient Buddhist wisdom in a way that I was like, wow, this is actually really meaningful. And you can just imagine the next layer of, intelligence. Actors are real people. Thank you, Josh.
Josh, and now I need to find a new joke. Anyways, go on, guys.
But you can just imagine the next layer of technological advance actually would allow real questions from a real audience like me sitting there, and that this robot would answer it based on these ancient Buddhist texts. But what was really interesting was starting to think about, well, anyone who knows anything about religious leadership knows about the foibles and fallibilities of any human in that role. Like, is it actually good to have a robot in that role so that there's no, or at least hopefully less, abuse of power in that role? So it asks all these really interesting questions about what is the future of religious leadership. So anyway, there's one little example.
Casper, there's a quick question from Ines. Where did this happen? Where was this? The robot?
This was in Kyoto. The name of the temple temporarily escapes me. It's only open on Sundays, so you have to make sure that you're there on a weekend.
All right, talking about real people and not a robot, I would have a vulnerable moment. I have so much anxiety right now because we have 38 questions, and I'm like, how do you synthesize this? I had a plan. We were like, we're going to pick 3 questions, and I'm like, I love all these questions, and I'm just having a moment, and I'm not a robot. I'm not ChatGPT. I cannot synthesize this good enough. But there's one question or one theme that keeps weaving around ethics, capitalism, and I'll use Neil's summary because not only does he have a compliment in there, and I love compliments, but he goes, I feel inspired that creativity is happening and that the spirit is bubbling up all over the globe. So this is a compliment for all of us, not just me, which I don't know how I feel about that. So the question is, I feel troubled by the risk that innovation can become an idol, and how to discern when it's promoting flourishing versus tickling our consumerism or novelty seeking. Novelty seeking. English is not my first language. Novelty seeking. So with that, who wants to go first? This is our last question, and I want to hear from all 3. So it's the notion of ethics, capitalism, staying true, staying focused, results-oriented to a flourishing world.
I'll just get us kicked off here, Habib. I think that I was very heartened in some of these interviews that our amazing researchers did to see people, some of these spiritual innovators pushing back on us with even that line of questioning, that some of these are not intended to scale. Like, we're not interested in this like spreading out. And it wasn't that they wouldn't participate. They were just like challenging our assumption of that holy grail of innovation. Like, is innovation always good? We're not innovating. We're going back to the way things were before people came and mucked it up for us. Which I found to be just like a perfectly authentic and lovely way of turning this on its head, and not better or worse, just like adding another dimension to what counts as spiritual innovation and what is part of the landscape.
Thanks, Josh. Casper, Angie?
I know Angie will have a lot of wisdom to say, so one short note I'll say is that, and maybe this is a little provocative, but I think we should also be careful of assuming that like religion and spirituality has always been separate from money, from commercial life, from, like these things have always lived together. And so to put spirituality in this place of purity, I think is itself really a dangerous way to come into this conversation, right? Like, life has always been intertwined, and that is true now. And the thing I would say that gives me hope is that a lot of, I would say certainly a majority of the people we spoke to were wrestling with these very questions, right? With having to think through, well, I need to make a living, or if I do this work for free, I have to have so then what? I want it to be accessible to everyone, and we have to be able to pay for the room that we're gathering in. So it's not like folks who are doing this innovation work are not conscious of these questions. And I think the answers are going to look very different in different places. That was definitely a humbling part of the research process, was that, to try and come up with one kind of defining system or even principle is very difficult to do, because it just, again, context looks so different in each place.
Casper. Angie, you want to take us home?
I love this question, and we sit with it all the time. First, just to acknowledge the impact of capitalism and a number of other sort of macro forces were completely inextricable from this research. And we didn't touch on it as fully as we might have. There's more on it in the report, but the role of the state, the role of market capitalism, like they were just so fundamental to the way things are playing out. And so just to really fully acknowledge how significant this question is. And with that being said, one of the things that we're really hopeful about is this question of economic imagination to accompany our spiritual imagination. Because the sense we had was really that a lot of the folks doing this work would end up defaulting to certain economic models, often because they just didn't know of any other alternative, right? So someone who's offering a one-on-one healing session will have a fee-for-service model because that's how everything else is, right? So it's just like, well, I need to make a living from this. This is how you make a living, and so I charge for my work, and it's even if one might have a sort of ethic around spiritual care being something that should be offered for free, there is just a real mismatch there between what an individual innovator might know is possible and what we could imagine together, or perhaps what has been done throughout history in different contexts. So that's one area of research and practice that we're really interested in pursuing as a hub going forward, is this question of economic imagination. And let's try some stuff in that realm. But the last thing I'll say, and maybe I'll transition with this, Habib, to helping to close us out, is one of my favorite spiritual innovations and innovators. There's a fellow named Nipun Mehta who leads Service Space and Awaken around the world, but largely in India. And Service Space they put on these gorgeous gatherings, and I was speaking to some of their leadership recently, and they're all volunteer led anyway. But they said, if someone completes a retreat of ours and they say, oh, the volunteers were so amazing, then we have not done our job. If they come out of it and they say, oh, the retreat was so amazing, we have not done our job. But if they come out of the event and they say, I feel called to go love the other, I feel called to be in a way that I have just experienced in the world, then perhaps we have done something good. And I think that is what we see the potential of in many of these innovators and innovations. And so our hope is to help support them in doing that, and also to amplify and lift up the incredible work already being done.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks, Casper. Josh, thanks for having me as trusting me to ask the right questions, but most important, thanks for you all for trusting me to make sure the questions get answered. And I also leave energized, grateful, but mostly dreaming too as well, that maybe one day we could do this in the room, or like you said, either in the forest or on a boat, or in a boat in the forest. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Angie, to close us out, but I really do appreciate you all, and we'll get those questions answered.
Thank you, Habib. So I will just reiterate a couple of things before we close out with Alicia returning to bless us on our way. So just a reminder that we would really love to stay in touch with all of you, and you have just offered such incredible comments throughout this time, and I look forward to reading them later. But please fill in the post-event response form, share your interest in this work going forward. Let's stay connected. And we were just speaking to it, but we're just grateful to know that so many of you are out there creating this future world that we so deeply hope for. Charles Eisenstein called it the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And so as we leave today, just given how much of the world can feel hard and sometimes even hopeless, we want to leave on a note of imagination, and to invite you to imagine a world in which spiritual imagination is a global priority, and that we are applying ourselves to the kind of innovation that puts spiritual needs at the center. A world in which the melody of material innovation responds to the rhythm of spiritual depth, moral integrity, and ethical consideration. As a well-tuned instrument fills the air with music, so too could a transformed society that puts our industries and economies in service of individual and collective flourishing. So may we all do our part to help cultivate this future world that is grounded in love, wisdom, and spiritual liberation. With that, I want to invite back Alicia Forde to help bless us as we go. Alicia.
Thank you, Angie. What greater blessing is there than thank you? Friends, it has been a delight to share this time with you, to see the activity in the chat, to see the ways in which you are connecting with each other. We honor your commitments to that which is larger than yourself, and we honor your journey to address the particular spiritual longings of our time. Know that you are enough, that your work is enough. You are needed, your work is sacred, you are here. We are here together, journeying in courage and hope, and truly we are grateful. Grateful that we can accompany each other in cultivating a future world grounded in love, grounded in wisdom, grounded in spiritual liberation. May you be blessed, be well, and thank you so much for being with us on this journey.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Casper, Josh, and Habib. Thank you, Ben, behind the scenes, for being a rock star. And thank you, above all, to all of you who are here with us and all of you who may watch this recording in future, for your hearts and your spirits and your incredible work in the world. Thank you all. Have a beautiful day.